At 31,000 feet, both pilots suddenly collapsed, the radios went dead, and the storm outside was getting worse. Panic spread through the cabin, until an 11-year-old girl stood up and said 5 words.
I have to try.
At 31,000 feet above the Pacific Northwest, silence can be more terrifying than any scream. Flight 728 had been in the air for almost 90 minutes. 148 passengers were watching movies, sleeping, checking emails, or staring through windows at a sea of clouds. Nobody was worried. Nobody had any reason to be. Until the cabin lights blinked. Once. Then twice. And suddenly, every sound connecting the aircraft to the outside world disappeared. No radio. No cockpit intercom. No passenger call system. Even the transponder stopped responding. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Mercer stared at his instruments. Naomi. The first officer looked over. I've got nothing. Daniel switched frequencies. Static. He tried another. Nothing. Emergency frequency. Silence. Then Naomi picked up the cockpit interphone. She pressed the button. Cabin, this is the cockpit. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. Daniel's expression hardened. That's impossible. The aircraft itself was still flying perfectly. Engines normal. Hydraulics normal. Flight controls normal. But every communication system had vanished at exactly the same moment. And then something even worse happened. Daniel reached for the control panel. His vision suddenly blurred. Naomi looked toward him. Captain. Daniel tried to answer. But the words never came. His head dropped forward. Seconds later, Naomi collapsed too. Neither pilot moved. And while the aircraft continued silently through the darkness above the clouds, 148 passengers remained completely unaware that the people responsible for bringing them home were no longer conscious. Except one passenger. An 11-year-old girl sitting beside the window. Her name was Elena Park. And unlike everyone else aboard Flight 728, she understood exactly what the silence meant. Elena Park looked like every other child on the flight. Small. Quiet. And far more interested in the stuffed fox sitting on her lap than the adults around her. She was traveling alone from San Francisco to Portland to spend the summer with her grandmother. The flight attendant, Grace Holloway, had checked on her twice already. Everything okay, sweetheart? Elena smiled. Yes, thank you. Grace noticed the aviation magazine sticking halfway out of Elena's backpack. You like airplanes? Elena quickly pushed the magazine deeper into the bag. My dad likes them. Grace smiled. Well, you're safe with us. Those words stayed with Elena. Because suddenly, she wasn't sure they were true. She watched Grace attempt to contact the cockpit. Nothing. The flight attendant frowned. She tried the cabin call system. Still nothing. Then Elena noticed something nobody else seemed to understand. The aircraft had been flying perfectly straight for several minutes. No small heading corrections. No altitude changes. No normal pilot adjustments. Her father had taught her what that meant. Autopilot. But autopilot could not solve everything. Elena quietly opened her backpack. Inside was a small tablet. To everyone else, it looked like a child's gaming device. But inside was something very different. A flight simulator. Her father had installed it years earlier. Victor Park had once been a commercial pilot. Until a medical emergency forced him to leave the cockpit. After that, he had begun teaching Elena. Not because he expected her to become a pilot. Because he believed children should understand the world around them. And he had one rule. If you ever see something unusual in an airplane, don't panic. Elena looked toward the front of the cabin. The flight attendants were gathering. Passengers were beginning to whisper. And Elena whispered to herself, Dad, something happened. Grace Holloway had worked as a flight attendant for 21 years. She had seen turbulence. Medical emergencies. Passengers who panicked over harmless noises. But she had never experienced this. She approached the cockpit door. Captain Mercer. No answer. She entered the emergency access code. The system unlocked. Grace pushed the door open. And froze. Both pilots were unconscious. Captain Mercer was slumped against his harness. Naomi Reed had fallen sideways. Their oxygen masks were still hanging above them. The instruments were alive. The autopilot was engaged. But the cockpit was silent. Grace immediately checked their pulses. Both were alive. She called for medical assistance. Nothing. The intercom remained dead. So Grace walked into the cabin. Her face told the passengers everything before she said a word. Ladies and gentlemen. The cabin became quiet. We have a serious situation. People stopped moving. Grace swallowed. Both pilots are currently incapacitated. A woman screamed. A man immediately stood. Can someone fly the aircraft? Grace looked down the aisle. Is there a pilot aboard? Silence. Then Marcus Bell raised his hand. I flew military helicopters. Grace rushed toward him. Can you fly this? Marcus hesitated. Not this aircraft. Grace looked around. Anyone? No answer. Then a tiny voice came from seat 22A. I can. Nobody moved. Grace turned. I'm sorry. I can fly it. A few passengers laughed nervously. Someone whispered that the child was confused. Marcus shook his head. Sweetheart, sit down. Elena looked directly at him. I know what an FMC is. Marcus stopped. She continued. I know what the PFD and navigation display show. The cabin went silent. Grace stared at her. How old are you? 11. Grace looked toward the cockpit. Then back at Elena. For the first time, she wondered if the strangest person aboard the aircraft might also be their best chance. Grace didn't immediately believe Elena. Neither did Marcus. But Elena wasn't asking them to believe her. She was asking them to test her. Ask me something, she said. Marcus folded his arms. What happens if we lose communication? Set the appropriate communication failure code if the transponder works. Maintain assigned heading and altitude. Attempt alternate communication methods. If communication remains impossible, follow visual flight procedures. Marcus stared at her. What does the attitude indicator tell you? Aircraft pitch and bank relative to the horizon. And the airspeed? Indicated speed through the air. Altitude. Vertical position above sea level. Marcus slowly lowered his arms. Grace looked at Elena's tiny hands. You've actually trained? Yes. How? My dad. Elena pulled out her tablet. On the screen was a flight simulator cockpit. Marcus recognized the interface. His expression changed. How long? Since I was 9. Grace stared at her. You've never flown a real airplane? No. Then why should we put you in that cockpit? Elena looked toward the unconscious pilots. Because you don't have anyone else. Nobody answered. Marcus looked at Grace. Grace looked at the cockpit. Then she made a decision. Elena. The little girl nodded. Let's go. As Elena walked toward the cockpit, passengers moved aside. Some prayed. Some cried. Others stared at her as if watching a child walk into a storm. Inside the cockpit, Elena climbed into the first officer's seat. Her feet barely reached the pedals. She looked at the instruments. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Okay, Dad." Her hands moved toward the controls. "I'm ready." Elena's hands were shaking. She didn't try to hide it. "I've never done this for real." Marcus looked at her. Neither have most people who suddenly find themselves in impossible situations. Elena gave a nervous smile. Then she remembered her father. Victor Park had spent hundreds of evenings teaching her inside his study. He had built emergency scenarios into the simulator. Engine failure. Navigation failure. Weather emergencies. Instrument failure. Even complete communication loss. But he had never taught her how to become a hero. He taught her how not to panic. Trust the instruments, he used to say. Your feelings can lie to you. Elena looked at the screens. Everything suddenly became familiar. Altitude. Heading. Speed. Engine status. Fuel. Flight director. Autopilot. She breathed slowly. Heading 278. Marcus read the display. 278. Altitude 31,000. 31,000. Speed 452 knots. Marcus nodded. Everything stable. Elena looked through the windshield. Nothing but clouds. Then she noticed something. Our route isn't taking us where it should. Marcus leaned forward. What? Autopilot is following the last programmed route. Can it get us to Portland? Eventually. Then what's wrong? Elena pointed at the navigation display. The weather. A massive storm system had developed ahead. The aircraft was heading toward it. Elena looked at the fuel readout. We don't have enough fuel to make unnecessary mistakes. Grace entered the cockpit. What do we do? Elena answered without hesitation. We find another airport. There was one enormous problem. They couldn't ask anyone for help. No radio. No transponder. No intercom. No reliable connection to air traffic control. They were invisible. Elena opened the navigation charts. Her father had taught her how to navigate without electronic assistance. Look outside, he used to say. Technology can fail. Geography doesn't. Elena studied the coastline. Then the mountains. Then the route. We're farther south than I thought. Marcus looked at her. How sure are you? About 80%. That's not reassuring. It's enough. She pointed toward the map. If we turn east, we can reach a large regional airport. Which one? Redmond. Marcus frowned. Can you find it without GPS? Yes. How? Roads. Rivers. Mountains. Elena adjusted the aircraft's heading. The autopilot remained engaged. She didn't want to disconnect it yet. First, she needed to understand the aircraft's condition. The storm was growing. Dark clouds stretched across the horizon. Lightning flashed inside the distance. Grace looked frightened. Are we going into that? No. Elena's voice remained calm. We're going around it. Marcus looked at the tiny girl. You sound like you've done this before. Only in a simulator. He gave a nervous laugh. Right. Elena watched the storm. Then she noticed the fuel. The number continued falling. We have approximately 2 hours. Is that enough? If everything goes perfectly. Marcus looked at her. And if it doesn't? Elena didn't answer. Because they both knew. They couldn't afford many mistakes. The aircraft reached the edge of the storm. Elena changed course. The plane turned smoothly. But the turbulence began anyway. The cabin shook. Overhead compartments rattled. Passengers screamed. Grace grabbed a handrail. Marcus tightened his seatbelt. Elena's hands remained on the controls. A violent drop suddenly pushed the aircraft downward. Marcus shouted. Altitude. Elena corrected. 300 feet lost. Another jolt. The windshield filled with clouds. Lightning flashed. For one terrifying second, Elena could see nothing. Her instinct screamed at her to pull up. But she remembered her father's voice. Never chase fear. She looked at the instruments. Artificial horizon stable. Speed acceptable. Engine readings normal. She made a small correction. Let the airplane fly. Marcus stared at her. You okay? No. Elena swallowed. I'm terrified. But you're still flying. She nodded. The turbulence slowly weakened. They emerged beneath the cloud layer. And suddenly Elena saw something incredible. A river. A highway. And beyond them, a long mountain range. She reached for the chart. That's the Deschutes River. Marcus looked down. How do you know? My dad took me there when I was little. She traced the river with her finger. We're close. For the airport? Yes. Elena turned toward Marcus. We're going to Redmond. He looked at the storm behind them. Then at the child beside him. Let's get everyone home. At 12,000 feet, Elena finally saw the city. Small roads. Buildings. A river. And then, runways. There. Marcus leaned forward. Where? Southwest. He saw them. 2 strips of concrete surrounded by open land. Elena smiled for the first time. That's Redmond. Grace entered the cockpit. You found it? Yes. Can we land? Elena looked at the runway. Maybe. The word frightened Grace. Maybe. Elena explained. We don't know the current wind. We don't have tower communication. We don't know whether emergency services are waiting. And I've never landed this airplane. Grace sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Elena remembered another lesson. Don't try to make a perfect landing. Marcus looked at her. Then what are you trying to make? A safe one. Elena began the descent. She kept the aircraft wide around the airport, studying the wind. Flags near buildings provided a clue. Smoke from a distant facility moved toward the east. She watched carefully. Wind from the west. Marcus nodded. Runway 29. Exactly. Elena configured the aircraft. Flaps. Speed. Altitude. Everything had to happen in sequence. Below them, vehicles were beginning to gather. Someone on the ground had noticed them. Emergency crews were preparing. But the aircraft remained silent. No radio call. No transponder. No explanation. Just a commercial jet circling an airport, with an 11-year-old girl preparing to land it. Elena began the approach. Her voice became quieter. Not because she was less confident. Because she was concentrating. Landing checklist. Marcus looked at her. What do you need? Gear. Gear. Down. Marcus moved the lever. The landing gear extended. 3 green lights appeared. Gear down. Flaps. Flaps set. Speed. 160. Elena adjusted the throttle. The aircraft descended. The runway slowly grew larger. But then the wind shifted. The aircraft drifted slightly. Elena corrected. Marcus watched her hands. Tiny movements. Nothing dramatic. No sudden control inputs. Just constant adjustments. Grace whispered, "She's really doing it." Marcus nodded. Yes. At 2,000 feet, Elena lined up with the runway. The aircraft was stable. Then a crosswind hit. The nose moved. Elena immediately corrected. The runway shifted back into alignment. Marcus exhaled. That was close. Elena didn't answer. She was staring at the runway. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Don't stare at the ground. Look where you want the aircraft to go. So Elena looked ahead. Not down. Not at the fear. Ahead. At the runway. At home. At survival. At the 148 people sitting behind her. Final approach, she whispered. The aircraft descended through 1,000 feet. For the first time since the emergency began. Elena allowed herself one thought. Maybe they were going to make it. 500 feet. The runway filled the windshield. 400. Elena adjusted the pitch. 300. The aircraft descended smoothly. 200. Marcus called the numbers. 180. Stable. 170. Stable. 100 feet. Elena could see the runway markings. She could see the emergency vehicles waiting beyond the taxiway. She could see flashing lights. She could even see tiny people standing near the perimeter. They were ready. But Elena still had one final challenge. The aircraft was carrying a lot of weight. The runway was wet. The wind was inconsistent. And she had never physically landed a jet. 50 feet. Elena gently pulled back. 40. The aircraft floated. 30. The runway rushed beneath them. 20. Elena raised the nose slightly. 10. The main landing gear touched. Hard. The aircraft bounced. Passengers screamed. Elena immediately corrected. The wheels touched again. This time, they stayed down. "We're on the ground," Marcus shouted. But the aircraft was still moving at tremendous speed. Elena pushed the thrust levers into reverse. The engines roared. She applied the brakes. The entire aircraft shook. People were thrown against their seat belts. The runway disappeared beneath them. Elena kept the nose straight. "Come on." The aircraft continued slowing. "Come on." The end of the runway was getting closer. Then, 20 knots. 10. 5. And finally, 0. Flight 728 stopped. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Elena stared through the windshield. Her hands were still gripping the controls. Then she whispered, "We're home." The first sound was crying. Then cheering. Then applause. Passengers stood in their seats. Some hugged strangers. Some prayed. Some simply stared at Elena. Grace rushed toward her. She dropped to her knees and hugged the little girl. "You did it." Elena's body finally began shaking. "I was scared." "I know. I thought we'd crash." Grace held her tighter. "So did I." Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft. Paramedics rushed into the cockpit. Captain Mercer and Naomi Reed were still unconscious. Doctors began treating them immediately. Within minutes, Captain Mercer moved. His eyes opened. What happened? Nobody answered at first. Then he noticed Elena. "Who is that?" Grace smiled through tears. "That's the reason we're alive." Daniel stared at the child. "How?" Elena looked down. "My dad taught me." Captain Mercer slowly turned toward Marcus. Marcus nodded. "She's telling the truth." The captain looked at the 11-year-old girl. "You flew my airplane." Elena nodded. "For a while." Daniel smiled weakly. "Then I owe you my life." Elena didn't know what to say. She just wanted to go home. She wanted her mother. She wanted her stuffed fox. And she wanted everything to go back to normal. But outside the airplane, cameras were already arriving. By the time Elena stepped onto the airport tarmac, reporters were waiting. "Who are you? How did you learn to fly? Did you really land the plane? Were you scared?" Elena covered her ears. She didn't want cameras. She didn't want fame. She wanted her mother. Then an aviation investigator approached. His name was Thomas Avery. He didn't ask her about fame. He asked one question. "Who trained you?" Elena pointed toward the road. "My dad." Hours later, Victor Park arrived. He was still using a wheelchair. The moment he saw his daughter, his face collapsed with emotion. Elena ran toward him. Victor wrapped his arms around her. "You came home." "I did." He looked at the reporters. Then back at Elena. "What happened?" She whispered. "The airplane went silent." Victor closed his eyes. He understood immediately. "And you remembered?" "Everything." Victor began crying. For years, people had questioned why he taught his daughter so much about aviation. Now nobody questioned him. But Victor did not call Elena a hero. He simply said, "I'm proud of you." Elena hugged him tighter. "I was scared, Dad. I know. I almost gave up. But you didn't." She looked at him. "Because you told me what to do." Victor smiled. "No." He touched her hair. "I taught you how to think." The investigation lasted months. Experts examined the aircraft. They studied the electrical system. They analyzed weather patterns. They checked every communication component. The final conclusion was extraordinary. A chain of rare electrical failures had disabled the aircraft's communication systems while leaving the primary flight controls operational. The pilots had suffered temporary incapacitation caused by the cockpit environmental failure. The autopilot had remained functional. And the aircraft had continued flying. But the investigators discovered something else. Without Elena's intervention, Flight 728 would probably have entered the storm. The aircraft would have continued toward its original route. Fuel reserves would have become dangerously low. The pilots might not have recovered in time. And with no communication, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The report praised the emergency response. It praised Marcus Bell. It praised Grace Holloway. It praised the pilots. But one name appeared repeatedly. Elena Park. 11 years old. Passenger. Not pilot. Not crew member. Passenger. The aviation world debated her actions. Some called her extraordinary. Others said no child should ever be placed in such a position. Elena didn't care about either argument. She had never wanted to fly a commercial airplane. She had simply seen a problem and knew something that might help. That was all. The attention became unbearable. Television interviews. Magazine covers. School reporters. People asking for photographs. Strangers recognizing her in public. Elena hated it. One afternoon, she returned to her father's study. The simulator was still there. The same controls. The same screens. The same aviation manuals. She sat in front of the simulator. Victor entered behind her. "You haven't touched it in months." Elena looked at the controls. "I don't want to fly anymore." Victor sat beside her. "That's okay. I thought I'd love it." "You don't have to." She looked at him. "Do you regret teaching me?" Victor smiled. "No. Even after everything. Especially after everything." Elena looked down. "I don't want people calling me a hero." Victor nodded. "Then don't let them decide who you are." She smiled. "I want to draw again." "Then draw." "I want to go back to school." "Then go." "I want to be normal." Victor reached over and hugged her. "Then be normal." Elena laughed. For the first time in months, she felt like an 11-year-old again. She opened her backpack. Inside was the same stuffed fox. She placed it beside the simulator. Then she opened a notebook. Instead of drawing an airplane, she drew a girl standing beneath a huge blue sky. No cockpit. No emergency. No cameras. Just freedom. Years later, Flight 728 became part of aviation history. Not because an aircraft lost communication. Not because two pilots became incapacitated. And not because an 11-year-old girl happened to be sitting in seat 22A. It became a story about preparation. Because when the impossible happened, Elena didn't suddenly become someone extraordinary. She simply remembered what she had already learned. She remembered her father's lessons. Trust the instruments. Control the aircraft. Think before acting. And never allow fear to make the decision for you. People often imagine heroes as fearless. But Elena wasn't fearless. She was terrified. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked. She wanted to cry. She wanted her mother. She wanted to run away. But she stayed. And sometimes, that is what courage really means. Not being fearless. Staying when fear tells you to leave. Years later, Elena would occasionally board airplanes. Sometimes she would sit by the window. Sometimes she would watch the pilots walking through the terminal. And sometimes, she would notice a child staring at the aircraft with curious eyes. She would smile. Because she knew something most people didn't. The person who saves the day doesn't always look like a hero. Sometimes they look ordinary. Sometimes they're sitting quietly in the back of the cabin. Sometimes they're 11 years old. And sometimes, they are simply the person who paid attention when everyone else was looking away. So the next time you step onto an airplane, look around. The person sitting beside you may seem completely ordinary. But you never really know what knowledge they're carrying. Because the sky can change in seconds. The lights can go dark. The radios can fall silent. And when that happens, the difference between disaster and survival may come down to one thing. Someone who knows what to do. This was the story of Elena Park. The girl who heard silence at 31,000 feet, and answered it with courage. This is Silent Empire. And remember, sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one everyone should have listened to.